Concord traffic, Cessna 309, heading to runway 35, Concord.
Okay, everybody hear me okay? Good afternoon and welcome to the work session on SB 134. I apologize a little bit for the doors. There was some issues there, but I think everything is resolved, and so I'm happy to see everybody here. So before we get started, I would like to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, so if everybody would please stand for that. If you'd heard my singing voice, Representative Woods, no, that would not be a good thing. So, so I think what I'd like to do is we have some members of the committee who, and Representative McDonald, are you sitting in for Representative Kofalt? I mean, Representative. No, Representative Markell. Sorry. Okay. So, so for the benefit of the folks in the audience who have not been here for every session, and for those members of the full committee who are sitting in and maybe weren't here for all session, what I'll do is I'll just quickly go through a brief summary of where we're at, and then talk through what we'd like to kind of do today. We do have a full executive session scheduled for the 12th. If everything goes well, hopefully we'll be on track to be able to bring something to the full committee at that time. So what happened is we've had the work session, And in the summer months, we had conversations between the department, the prime sponsor, and the governor's office about the bill, obviously, because the one big beautiful bill had passed, and the federal work requirements had become a mandate. And so with that in mind, the language of SB 134 was amended to basically pivot from being a waiver to being a plan. And the purpose for that was to allow us to go to the front of the line, because the federal government is looking at plans before they are waivers, and we want to make sure that we don't have any gap in coverage, and we wanted to make sure that we are as close to the front of the line as possible. Also, what we did is we tied the legislation as closely to the federal legislation as possible, and the reason for that being that if the federal government makes any changes to the federal law, we want to be able to have the state law pivot with it so that we don't have any gaps in coverage, and we felt that was vital. And so we have an amendment. There were copies put up on, I don't know if we had enough for everybody, on the desk from Representative Kofalt, which is 3051H. And that is basically the language that was worked out with the prime sponsor, the governor's office, and the department, which the Senate will be introducing, and basically aligns with the federal bill. Okay, so last week we had some discussions about that, and we were looking at some of the requirements within the federal legislation. And the federal legislation does give states a certain amount of latitude. One of the things that we discussed, for example, was the look back. You can have a 1 month look back or a 3 month look back. Those are things that are within the state's powers to control. And so Representative Kofalt came in with a list. I think it was a list of 11 bullet points where we said, are these things that we should clarify what our intentions are within the state law that are still in compliance fully with the federal law, so that, you know, if anything does change, we'll be okay. And in addition to so we think that that can be done. And also a proviso was put in which basically said that if in any case the federal law changes, that we would pivot with it. That basically was the safety net that we put in place so that we again ensure that we have no loss of coverage if the federal government pivots. And so those bullet points that had broad agreement amongst the committee when last we met 2 weeks ago, those were incorporated into Amendment 3054H. So that is the second amendment. So if nobody on the committee has any objections, since I think we've already gone through and we've already had the language for 2 weeks on Amendment 3051H, what I'd like to do in the hearing today is give Representative Kofalt an opportunity to talk through the contents of 3054H and kind of basically take the temperature of the committee on that. And then depending upon where that goes, I know there's been discussion, I know Representative Kofalt, between you and the department about how we might merge those amendments 351 and 3054. But before I get into discussion about the logistics of merging, I would like to first kind of go through what differentiates 3054 from 3051, what the additions were. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So looking at 3051H, and I know there's a couple of folks who were not here for, what's that?
Just give us line numbers, page and line numbers.
Yes, right now I'm just looking at the amendment
the
number 3051H.
Gotcha.
So as Representative McLean noted, this really aligns with the language that the department had worked out with the prime sponsor and the governor's office. And as I understand it, because current currently we have Medicaid requirements in state statute that have not been implemented. They are they are different from the federal requirements. What we really want to do is to go with the federal requirements for a number of reasons. That's going to be better, faster, and more financially viable. So we need to go from having a waiver to implement work requirements to simply saying we're implementing the program. If we fail to pass that or some flavor of that, that could be problematic. Essentially, it puts us at the back of the line in terms of where the states are with respect to some federal funding. So, so the first section of this, so 305.1H, Roman numeral 1, and Roman numeral 2 essentially do that. The lines 23 through 31, if I remember correctly, are essentially saying, well, those work requirements that currently exist in New Hampshire statute, we're not going to repeal them, we're going to suspend them, and as long as the federal requirements remain in place, those will be suspended. If the federal requirements ever go away, then those would be essentially reinstated. And so I think that summarized 305.1H. Where 305.4, and I'm going to encourage you to look at, you each should have a copy with green tabs on it. Thank you to John Williams and Henry Lippman and others for the work they've done in reviewing this. I will skip the markup for the time being and just focus on the provisions in this that are different from 305.1H. So in the packet with the green tabs attached, you actually have the first two pages are 305.1. So if you flip to the third page, this is where 305.4H begins. And this just begins with some definitions, but then it also essentially looks at some of the parameters that are defined in the One Big Beautiful Bill, and it says, here's where, from a policy perspective, here's where we would like the state of New Hampshire to be with respect to those. So lines 12 through 16 are essentially saying that the individual needs to demonstrate compliance with work requirements for the 3 consecutive months preceding the month in which they apply. And secondarily, it says that the department shall not accept self-attestation at the time of application. Roman numeral 3, line 17 through 19, again, says documentary evidence is required, and the department uses payroll records, unemployment records, and other such things, but verification shall occur on an ongoing basis, at least quarterly, and self-attestation shall not be accepted. Section 4 clarifies that the department may rely on ex parte records. In other words, they don't necessarily need to have the applicant produce all of this documentary evidence. They may seek that directly from other sources. For both fulfillment of the work requirements or exemption from work requirements. And again, self-attestation is not to be accepted. And then Section 5 simply says the department should not, shall not seek or implement any additional optional exemptions unless that receives the approval of the HHS Oversight Committee. And then Section 6 has to do with medical frailty and just, again, putting some definitions around what constitutes medical frailty that is in line with federal statute. I will return to the written comments there after I finish going through this. We did have some discussion last time about timelines because there was, in the original language I had proposed, there was language about disenrolling someone if they were not compliant with the requirements in the previous month. There were some, I simply removed that because I think it was confusing and potentially problematic to implement. So Section 7 talks about the notice requirements and the opportunity for a Medicaid recipient to address and fix the compliance requirements within a 30-day notice period. And then Section 8, which is lines 12 and 13 on page 2, and the paragraph that follows it, have to do with the severability clause. In other words, if there's anything that we're saying here that comes into conflict with federal law, if federal law changes, then we defer to federal law under those circumstances so that we don't end up with a conflict. Section 2, which is lines 18 through 26, and Section 3, lines 27 to the end, are again language from the other amendment, 305.1, that includes, among other things, the suspension of existing work requirements that are specific to New Hampshire, unless or until the federal government removes the Medicaid work requirement at some point in the future. So those are the changes. Now I want to sort of circle back to so it was my understanding that this would presumably these would presumably layer on top of each other. That the First Amendment 305.1H is sort of the must-pass amendment. 305.4H would be an optional layer on top of that. And again, thank you to the department for going through this and working with OLS to understand how this might fit into a single amendment. That is, if we take from 305.1H, if we were to take page 1, lines 3 through 22, and insert that at the beginning of the other amendment, that would essentially make 305.1H unnecessary, assuming that we adopted 305.4H. The other proposed changes are on page 2 of 305.4H. So second to the last page in your packet. On line 6, there's language inserted at the end regarding the frailty, sort of designation of somebody as being medically frail or having special needs beyond special needs. It references federal code, and the insertion would simply say, unless as otherwise modified in Public Law 119.21, Section 71119, 2025. And again, this is a little bit like the severability clause. It's just saying if something changes in federal law, we don't want to end up in a situation where we are conflicting with federal law. The second insertion is on line 13, and it is directly related to the severability section. This references federal statute, so we don't want to be in conflict with federal statute. We also don't want to be in conflict with the federal regulations. So this would simply add "or regulation." So that summarizes my comments.
All right, so before we get into a little bit of the sausage making, and I'll let the other members of the committee kind of, I just have two quick questions. So with respect to, first question, with respect to any of these amendments, have you guys been able to identify, any poison pills that you see as danger? I mean, I think we've been through this. We're at week 3, but I just want to make sure that you don't see any danger zones here. that we should be aware of or we're going to get caught short on?
For the record, Henry Lippman, the state's Medicaid director.
John Williams, Director of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Health and Human Services.
I think that what's put out here does comply with the interest of being consistent with federal law. I think that the policy choices are consistent with federal law limits. As the director, as I testified to earlier, the concern I would have, not in the legislation itself, but when you look at the different things that the state has to accomplish in terms of speeding up long-term care eligibility determinations, doing more frequent eligibility determinations, is, we don't want to fall behind in those two things. If this doesn't work out, we have to go back to legislation to adjust, the requirements if that was what was needed to, keep pace with our eligibility. But as this sits right now, the legislation is, I think, clean with respect to being aligned with federal and within the limits described in the federal regulation.
Okay, and then my second question, and then I'll open it up to the other folks on the committee, is 54 has a little bit more specificity with respect to reporting, and I just want to talk on, so if we go to 54, and I guess we'll go with, I don't know if everybody has the marked up one, so just for the sake of the folks here that don't have the unmarked copy, if I go to the 3054 amendment as originally provided, and I'm looking at Roman 3 and I'm looking at Roman 4, okay, so we got a lot more specificity. How is that, how do you envision that playing out? So do you see, because, self-attestation shall not be accepted, so is this going to be that you're basically, in other words, once a person applies and they do their first application, is that going to be kind of it for them, and then you're going to be going out on your own and grabbing stuff on your own within the department? Or I'm just trying to how is that going to apply in the real world?
Sure. So someone who's never been on Medicaid before, if they fill out an application, the first thing we look at is whether they provided information, or we could find information that they had been compliant with the requirement for the way it's currently structured for the 90 days before applying. If they weren't, we could not approve them for Medicaid until they reach that point. So either they could provide us documentation, or we can find through what we call ex parte process that they would comply. Now could comply by either having demonstrated the work, or that they qualify for an exemption to begin with.
But let's say I'm someone I'm on Medicaid right now. I'm on Medicaid expansion right now, so I'm not doing a new application.
Right.
And this rolls in. What is their experience going to be? I think more, because the new people coming in, they're applying. I'm not so worried about those folks, but the people who are already in, how is this gonna land?
I'll answer that question, but I do worry more about actually the people who've never been on before, of them knowing that they need to have complied with a requirement before they even knew that they were going to do a Medicaid application. That's my more worry point. In terms of people who are on it, they will get advance notice of the requirement to comply ahead of the requirement of being, having met the number of times that they have to be in compliance. So people who are starting, the first notice would say go out in September or October. The people who would start to have to comply as of January 1, they would have a period where they could get ready to be able to comply. In fact, we probably want to push that noticing out even earlier to make sure they have a better runway to come into compliance.
And so, sorry.
And so then we would do, then we would also do redeterminations every 6 months. So we'd be checking to see if they're if they're still eligible, and then again in another 6 months. So that would be sort of the process that we would go through. So someone, when the program kicks in, someone who's already on the program will have redetermination on their regularly scheduled date, or if it's not fall within the six. Let me start again here. I think I'm getting it more confusing than I need to. So someone who is already on the program, let's say in September,
Okay.
right? January comes along. This is when they need to start to comply. Let's say their redetermination, 6-month redetermination date is, say, July or June. We'll say July. Then we'd look back to see that they've complied during that period. The way it's currently structured, they would need to comply each month to maintain their eligibility. And that's a 6-month window. That would be the requirement, that they would have met it each month for those 6 months.
And unless they're self-employed or something like that, which we spoke about in the last meeting, that's just something that the department would be grabbing data on, or that's something that they would have to be providing on an ongoing basis every 6 months.
They would actually, I think the way we have it structured here, they would supply that information monthly. And we're actually working on, CMS has developed an app that people can pull down this information regularly and upload it into our system. Or we have, if we're picking up information from Employment Security, we could grab it ourselves.
So I guess I asked my 2 questions, but I'll ask a third one. And so this app then is going to be what you think is going to be different than, because I know you put a huge amount of effort into noticing in 2019.
Yep.
And you still had, so you're thinking that the app is going to help bridge that.
The app is part of the solution. I think there's a lot of work in terms of making people aware of what the requirements are. I think the issue we had 19 was that we were still changing the requirements all the way through, and they were a little bit more complex than the federal program is designed to be. So I think in terms of communicating what someone has to do, I think this federal program's more straightforward and is sort of what every state needs to do it, unless they have a waiver.
Okay. Does anybody else on the committee have any comments they'd like to share? Yes, Representative Hyman.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I think listening to the back and forth. So the burden really is on the applicant.
The burden's on the applicant to the extent that the department doesn't have a source to get it themselves. And ex parte basically means if we have access to data, we're to use it. And so we do at times have access to data. So the person wouldn't be required to, and that's built into the federal law, which wasn't into our state law, that to the extent that we have a source of that information, we don't have to make the person go out and do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you expand a little bit on that? What you think the chances of you finding out someone's employment background as they apply?
So we have access to employment security here. They also they can give us access to employment records. I think the app is designed for those people who are getting paid through one of the payroll services like an ADP or whatever, that they can sign in to their, sort of like if you've ever done your taxes, TurboTax or something like that, where you can pull down your statements. It's a function somewhat like that to pull down payroll data. But we also can go through a tax return, different, what they give us permission to do.
Okay. Can you just ballpark what percentage of applicants you think you'd be able to have information? My concern is obvious. Somebody is applying, can they get on? Are they going to be supremely challenged? Because going to former employers sometimes is a bit of a challenge for people.
It would be,
records.
I mean, that's what I think good about the app is that you don't have to necessarily go through your employer. If you have a passcode to get into your account, you can go directly. You don't have to go through your employer, because that is, sometimes we saw employers didn't want to provide information directly.
But can you guess at the sort of,
I would say that anywhere between 60 and 80% will be able to
so
use something like that.
maybe as many as 40% won't be able to?
Yes.
Just a guess. Okay.
Representative Weber, you had some thoughts?
I just had some questions, and thank you very much for the indulgence because I'm not a member of the committee and I'm new at this, but I had a couple of questions that maybe you could just clarify for me. And they really have to do with the federal, the places where the federal guidelines have some leeway. So my first question would be, do the federal guidelines allow self-attestation?
The OB3
Is that one possibility?
is a possibility under OB3 for an exemption purpose that you can provide the state has the option to provide to allow self-attestation of for an exemption purpose. So if I'm saying that, for example, I have a disability, I could say represent that I have a disability, and that would be accepted at least initially.
Okay.
Whereas I think rather than accepting it initially, you would ask them to provide documentation to support their claim.
And then my other question was, I think when we were discussing earlier, there was a possibility that when we say the 3 consecutive months on line 13 of 3054, they have to have 3 months compliance immediately preceding the month when they apply. But they may not have known that they needed that 3 months ago. And my understanding was that 1 month was a possibility. What are the parameters in the federal?
Yeah, 1 to 3 months is the
Okay.
option that the state has. And that, I was speaking at the beginning, I think what's in here is compliant. I think that
Right.
that may be a challenge for some people. I think it increases one of our communication challenges to have to, educate not just people who are currently enrolled, but people who might be enrolled.
Well, and you don't know when you're going to have a medical emergency or something that's going to force you into this. So my question for the committee, for members of the committee, on the policy side is, why are we choosing, if our goal is to both verify that people are doing what they're supposed to do, but we're also interested in making sure we're taking care of people, why are we not enacting the least restrictive options in the federal program rather than a more restrictive option? And I would hope that as a state, our choice would be to pick the least restrictive of those options and the one that would include the most people if they can manage to get over those barriers, because the barriers are still pretty high, even if you're choosing 1 month rather than 3 months. So, but I wasn't party to those discussions. So.
Representative Cole?
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, I guess my sense of this overall is that what I would like to see is for us to ensure integrity in the program, and I think there's a lot of the parameters that are laid out in the federal legislation are offering some parameters for the states to kind of come up with that decision. Generally speaking, I think the more we can ensure that this is directed to the people who are most in need and are compliant with it, the better. I don't think that 3 months is a terribly high bar. My biggest concern that is addressed through a lot of these is the self-attestation, because I think that is a pretty big loophole, and I think if people are coached by somebody who, and I think there's a lot of folks out there in the community who sort of know the rules and know how to work, game the system. My concern is that, that happens and it diverts money from those who truly need it to those who don't need it or don't want to play by the rules. So That's my intention here.
Yes, Representative Webber.
Could I just offer a clarification of where I'm coming from with that? And I do understand your concern about integrity of the system, and I share that. People who shouldn't be on it. But I'm thinking in my prior law practice of the number of elders that I dealt with who were hale and hearty on Thursday, had a stroke on Friday, and need Medicaid because they had a stroke and they're now in catastrophic circumstances. And they wouldn't necessarily be compliant because they might have been happily retired for those 3 months and happily paying all of their bills for that 3 months and not needing Medicaid for that 3 months. And then at a time when they are least able to produce the stuff that they need to produce, and at a time when their relatives are all trying to find the stuff, figure out where Granny kept everything, being in another state, trying to figure all of that stuff out, we are disqualifying them for 3 months from a benefit that they actually need. I mean, I'm kind of horrified that we disqualify them for 1 month, but 3 seems punitive in those circumstances. I'm worried about, there are 2 balancing considerations. One is the people who are taking advantage, and I get that. But I equally think it's much worse to put roadblocks in the way of citizens who've always been compliant with everything, always paid their bills, always taken care of stuff, and are faced with a real tragedy. And it seems like the effect on those people is going to be punitive. Because to me, those people are deserving and ought to have it. And I'm stuck in the healthcare thing of I don't think people ought to be deserving to have healthcare anyway. But if we're going to look at deserving, I want to be sure that people who really need this and are of goodwill get it. So my concern would be, I mean, presumably the federal guidelines are there to prevent people taking advantage. And therefore, my preference would be to adopt the most lenient of the federal guidelines. But that's just a comment, and I don't get to vote.
You had a comment as well?
Yes, just carrying on with that. Again, I get confused myself with all the parameters. But like you said, person has a stroke, family's trying to help them out. Medicaid has a look back period as well. Would that come into play? In other words, on day 1, family identifies that grandma is going to need all this care, applies, processes in place, and it may be 60 days or 90 days or whatever before determination can be elicited. There's a look back. Would that then sort of answer some of the concerns we have about people who become suddenly exposed?
So we're talking about the Medicaid expansion population, which is an income-based only determination. I would say, though, that one of the things that we do see is that people who might qualify for something more, right, might start in a granted advantage because they can get health care quicker than because the look back time takes some time for us to process. And so, you know, someone who, let's not even say is a grandmother, but maybe 60 years old, still subject to the requirement if they were to have a catastrophic event, probably may be eligible for a waiver, but they want to get medical care in that window between maybe making a more explicit application to get, say, long-term care or CFI or something else, that person won't be able to access their a benefit until they get the waiver or the more extensive Medicaid eligibility. The issue with that, right, when I think about overall costs for the state, if people who get health care earlier, who really need health care, delaying health care sometimes makes it more costly. So I think there's a segment of the population where the requirement may not be a good thing for the individual who has that kind of event, because they could start to get health care much quicker based on income. But if they don't have that option, then they'll have to wait until, which could be a 90-day kind of process for them. So that, I think, is the downside of that. But I think that, you know, the three consecutive months is still within the tolerance of what you know, is permissible by a state. But I can see, as Medicaid director, that we will have times where we could have some people who get into a situation where they're not in a good place because they're not going to be able to satisfy the requirement. They'll ultimately be able to get Medicaid, but they'll have gone a period of time where they may not have access to a service that they need.
And could I have one more indulgence? Thank you, and I really appreciate it. The concern that I have here is the language here, and I may be mixing apples and oranges,
Sure.
so because of the traditional Medicaid and then expansion. But there's always been this issue of you apply on a certain date for Medicaid, and then, you know, it may take a while to make the determination and it refers back to the application date. But in this case, we're talking about what happened not 3 months before you receive the benefit. You're talking about 3 months before the actual application.
Correct.
And that seems to me to be a little difficult when you don't know 3 months beforehand when you're going to have a medical incident or something that's, or other things that are going to require the coverage.
Thank you, Representative Weber. And I personally, looking at this, I was kind of along the lines of Representative Colfont. I don't think that a 3 month requirement is a high bar. Representative Weber brought up the situation, though. What about if someone, has a stroke and her relatives are out of state and they're trying to gather up information? I would think it would be difficult to gather information just for 1 month as much as 3, but maybe not. But if she has a stroke, would she not be covered under the frailty provisions that we have here? So that, I mean, I'm just really realistically trying to assess the risk, because I don't want, my 60-year-old grandmother to lose coverage because she had a stroke, but I thought she'd be covered by the frailty provision. Am I wrong?
So again, the frailty provision requires documentation of that. So it may, certainly, I think in the case of a stroke, that you still could get the documentation, but it provides some relief in that sense. But it does defer, if you will, for a period of time until you provide that documentation because of the self-attestation being ruled out. Whether that can be done quickly or not in terms of getting, I think we require in here, like the doctor to provide a note, however, what distance that would be, or maybe you could rely on, you could accept, like, if someone could get the record from the emergency room, we could use that as the determining factor. But I think that, as I said before, I think it's not, 3 months is within the realm of what has been decided to be okay federally. I just think there are some people that may be disadvantaged by that situation. And so there's a balance between, I think, the integrity of those who really can work and should be working, and those that may be in a different place.
So, in your opinion, in the situation that Representative Weber described, would you be more likely to be looking at the work evidence, or more likely to be looking at the frailty evidence, and see which? I understand there's challenges to achieving both,
Yep.
but where would people typically be pivoting to?
So I think that the person in their application would probably need to let us know that it's for frailty purposes, right? So I think that it potentially could be quicker through the frailty, but here again, in terms of how we have to, when you look at all the work we have to do in long-term care and other people applying, sometimes we can't pick it up immediately to do it. It may take us a number of days or weeks sometime to get to something that's been submitted, and therefore have the chance of causing delay. It could be if it was even a 1 month requirement too, I think, as you point out, right? Again, I think it's where I sort of land on this. It's a policy decision. My only suggestion would be is try to create something where if the policy is not working, that you don't have to wait a year to go through a legislative process to make an adjustment. That would be my only suggestion.
Representative Weber.
And I think, and I thank you both for the explanations, because I think I've now maybe understood if somebody is medically frail, that gets rid of the 3 month prior work requirement, because I was reading the 3 months as being the requirement in either case. So if they're medically frail, the 3 month work that's where the exception is.
Right,
Is that
so-
right?
Yes.
Okay,
So
I'm okay now then.
If you using an example of someone who is pregnant, they would automatically be exempt. If you had a child under 13, you'd be automatically exempt. So we're talking about a smaller population.
But yes, good discussion, and thank you for the explanation. Is anybody else? Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the subcommittee for all your work on this, and I apologize for being a few minutes late today. One question I had, actually I have a couple, if I may. One is, just to clarify, so the 3 months is for a new applicant, and then when the 6 month RED comes along, they have to verify every single month.
Right. I think the regulation, the statute that's proposed here is we'd be checking quarterly on the monthly, and then on redetermination. So if we saw on a quarterly review that they hadn't done anything in the previous 4 months, we'd have to notice them and then act on that. They would get 30 days to provide documentation that they hadn't provided, right, to support it.
Okay. Do I have another, Mr. Chairman? I know in some programs in the department, child care, for example, for a long time, and I don't know if that's still the case, but they had a different term than work requirement. It was approved activity. Like if you were going to school or if you were training or something like that. Does that apply here, or
Yes.
is it just if you're physically working?
No, it can be volunteering. It can be if you're going to school. It's basically any combination of work, education, and volunteering would be,
So it doesn't necessarily have to be generating an income, but that's something productive.
yes.
Thank you.
Representative Hart.
Yeah, just a comment. Appreciating Representative Kofold's points about program integrity. I sure appreciate that. I value the idea of people working whenever possible when they're on some sort of public assistance. But the idea that there's a big group of people out there who are manipulating the Medicaid system, and people are being coached into that. I've been working with poor people who have alcohol and drugs, mental health problems for 45 years. Those people exist, absolutely, but they are really out in the margin, well on the edge, just like any healthcare system. You have people who will take advantage where there's opportunity to do that. But again, this is a really small minority. So we're legislating here to really target a very, very small group of people. And the cost, I think, as Representative Weber points out, to people who are legitimately seeking help, those who we would all agree, if they were sitting in front of us, want help, we're putting access to help for those people at a real risk here. So I want to mention that. I think it's quite important. So.
Representative Woods.
Thank you, sure. Again, another comment. The original passage of this piece of federal legislation was to help people get well so they could work. And sometimes admitting all the machinations of administrating a program, sometimes we lose sight of the underlying purpose. The original legislation and the original purpose was to get the people healthier so they could work. I think we have to keep that in mind as well. Not that we haven't, and some of the comments we've heard will help in that regard, but sometimes we forget the underlying premise of what this whole program is meant to do.
Director Lippman.
Just wanted for Representative McDonald's interest. One of the other things that's in common is if you're subject to one work requirement, say TANF, or you can't be subject to two. So that someone wouldn't be in a position where they'd have to satisfy more than one work requirement that's out there. SNAP, TANF.
So does anybody in the committee have any other thoughts on the contents? Is there anybody else in the audience that has any other thoughts on the comments that they are the contents that they'd like to share? Okay, so that being said, next thing is we're going to have to look at these amendments, and we're going to have to talk about what do we bring to the committee next week. So on the one hand, we have 351, which is the bare bones amendment, which was, worked out with Senator Pearl. Then, then we have 354, which has some additional language and clarifications put into it. So I think I'd like to start with the easy. We got Representative Kofal.
Just yeah. So maybe you said this in the last phrase. So just point of clarification that 3054 would be further modified as noted in the packet with the green tabs on it with those changes.
Correct. So if we decided to go ahead with 3054, we could go with the amendment as it was and but it sounds like everybody's talking. We'd like to kind of have a merged amendment for when we go into which would basically incorporate 351 and 3054 together. So I think up in the air right now is the potential to bring two amendments to the full committee next week. 3051 on the one hand, and then a merged 3051, 3054 on the other hand. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to take the temperature, of the committee, and I think, well, we could just.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
The idea of merging this, there have been some preliminary discussions. Is there any way that would be ready to be presented to the committee?
Well, that would be the hope, depending upon where our discussions lie, and of course any committee member is able to bring in any amendment they want. But as I understand these discussions here, there's two potential amendments to bring to the committee: the bare bones amendment 3051, and then the one which is a merged amendment, which has a little bit more definition to it. So I think, is it okay, Mr. Chair, if we just do a straw poll for this, or do we have to have a formal vote? Straw poll, fine. Okay, so we'll start with the easy one. So 3051, which was the initial amendment, the one that we've been working on. Does anybody? Are we broadly speaking in support of the amendment? So raise your hands if you're in support of 3051.
That's the one we have.
Well, that we don't have to anyway. Whatever. Okay, so so 5 out of 5 with respect to that. So then the second amendment was 3054, which incorporates the self-attestation component and the 3-month look back. So just show of hands, who would be willing to support that amendment? Okay, so still, four out of 5. So I think it's worth bringing both these amendments forward to the committee then. So that means Representative Kofalt, 351 is all set. 354, you would like to have modified to basically be an inclusive amendment. Is that something that we think we could have for the 12th?
Yes, in fact, the committee assistant has already asked for those changes from OLS.
Okay.
So that has been communicated. And again, what has been communicated is pretty much what I reviewed, which is 3054, bringing in the first lines 3 through 22 from the other amendment, plus a few very minor changes to the severability language on page 2.
Okay.
So I expect that those would be ready in plenty of time for our next meeting as a full committee.
So what we'll do is we'll have those amendments drafted, and Representative McDonald will get those amendments out to the whole committee so that they can read them in advance. No talking amongst ourselves, but we'll get those out so everybody can read them in advance, and we should be ready for you on the 12th. So I think with respect to that, we're good. Did you gentlemen, you were talking amongst yourselves, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
I just would like to be there on the 12th. I didn't know what time you would be typically meeting. 10 a.m. Yeah, I have GNC at the same time, but I know I've got. I should be if I can get on early. I'm usually not on the agenda there, getting until about 11 or so. So have at least an hour.
Go ahead, Jesper.
So if we made this the first order of business, would it be helpful, or would it be
Yes.
better if it was the last order of business?
It'd be better if it's the first.
Okay, we'll bring this forward right at 10 a.m. then.
Okay. So with that being said, if everybody's comfortable with where we're at and nobody has, Representative Woods?
I just want to make a personal comment. I think the work we're doing is critical to make sure that we get the care to the proper people at the right time with the least amount of hassle. But that said, and I'm working to that end with the understanding that we really don't have a choice, that if we don't implement a program, the life for these same folks would be much more dire. So I want to be on the record that I'm adamantly opposed to work requirement. But I am working and voting with the idea that I'm trying to make it, under the circumstances that we're given our constituents the best possible care we can.
Well, yeah, thank you, and I respect those comments very much. Anybody have any other thoughts? Okay, so we are adjourned, and for those of you of interest, we'll see you on the 12th of November.